Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations, scheduling, planning and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by material requirement planning. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by material requirement planning, what are the factors that needs to be identified while planning for materials, and what are the various activities that have been undertaken under material requirement planning. Now first let's understand what do we mean by material requirement planning. The material requirement planning is a certain process for procurement of materials that has been required in the organization. When the activities right from production to the completion of the finished goods is being undertaken, in this particular stage, the requirement of materials may differ from point to point or time to time. For this particular concern, it is needed to be seen that the effective production activity is being undertaken over the period of time. For this particular concern, the requirement of materials as to raw material, the finished goods, the process or flow of goods in the organization should be effective and will be quite managed. When the management of materials right from the stores department, that is from the inventory to the finished goods is being executed, then such type of planning is called the material requirement planning. The concept of material requirement planning is based on the concept of the availability of demand for the product into the market and what supply will be undertaken by the organization. And for this particular concern, the availability of material on the assembly line is equally important. That is, when the actual production activity starts or is been undertaken, at that particular place or point of time, the material that has been required to manufacture a certain product or a certain commodity should be readily made available. So, material requirement planning is a system-based approach which look for all the needs of the manufacturing department or the manufacturing concern. That is, whatever goods and services that will be required for a specified time period, all those goods and services will be provided within the specified time period. Now let's understand what are the basic components of material requirement planning. The basic component of material requirement planning is the raw material itself, because it is the process through which the material passes on from one phase to another phase, that is from one machine to another machine, one process to another process, one cycle to another cycle. So in terms of the assembly line, the basic component is the material itself, and for the effective planning and effective completion of the cycle, we need to see that the raw material is effectively and sufficiently provided and it undertakes all the activities in a very effective way. The material requirement planning is the major activity or a task that is being undertaken by the inventory or the stores department, and hence the stores department or the inventory department has to see or undertake the certain responsibility about availability of raw material in the warehouse or in the godown. For those particular concern, the planning as to what quantity of material is available, whether the material will be sufficient, what is the quantity in terms of either grams, in terms of kilos, in terms of tons, and so on, should be measured very specifically, and accordingly the decision as to availability of material is needed to be undertaken. Furthermore, the material and products that are being manufactured, we need to prepare a schedule for the same. That is, at what cycle or for what duration the material will be demanded and will be required on the assembly line. So, matching the demand and matching the supply perspective plays an important role whenever we are planning for material requirement plan. Now, further going on, in this particular case, the production planning and scheduling, that is PPS, also plays a simultaneous important role. That is, with the help of material that is available in the inventory or in the stores department, one has to take into account what will be the production activity, how the production activity will be made in an effective way, and in what cycle or activity the production will be completed. And hence, the value of inventory that is available in the stores department, the amount or quantity that will be given to the production department, all those activities are needed to be done in a scheduled way, and accordingly the planning of all those activities are essentially required. Now let's understand the objectives of material requirement planning. The basic or the primary objective of material requirement planning is to see that the raw material and its component are easily accessible to the production. That is, whenever the production activity is being undertaken, whatever steps that are being implemented in the production cycle, at that particular stage, the raw material so required will be easily and readily made available, and accordingly, there will be no disturbance in the assembly line. So, providing the goods and services at the equivalent time and a specified time period with a specified quantity is the requirement of material plan. The another major or goal or objective of material requirement planning is to see that they have to simultaneously maintain all the activities that are available or that are going on the assembly line. That is, when the goods passes on from one machine to another machine, one stage to another stage. So at every stage, the material that is so required should be readily made available, and accordingly, there should be no hurdle in production process. So for those particular concern, availability of material, process of raw material, and disbursement of the material, whichever is being required, should be taken into account in a very effective way. And lastly, the another major goal objective of the material requirement planning is to see that whatever distinct objectives are being undertaken, that is, one job is always different from another. For all those particular jobs that are being undertaken, a well-planned or series of activities is being undertaken to see that whatever material that is being ordered, only that particular quantity or quality of material is being delivered at the specified machine. In this particular case, the idle time of the machine should be utilized, and accordingly, we have to see that there no any process or activity remains idle. And for this particular concern, the effective material planning is essentially required. So, eliminating or minimizing the idle time of machine is the basic objective of the material requirement plan. Now let's look at the advantages of the material resource planning. It aids in maintenance of minimum inventory level. So material requirement planning looks for maintaining the minimum amount of inventory level, wherein as and when the need arises, as and when the production activity is undertaken, we have to see that what amount or quantity or quality of goods and services will be required and how to maintain the inventory level. It decreases the related expenses by keeping the inventory level to a minimum. Based on the material requirement planning or the material resource planning, one can be easily able to identify what quantity of goods and services will be required on the process line or the production line. So, based on those concerns, the planning with respect to the availability of material in the warehouse, the reduction of the material plan with respect to the wear and tear of goods is ultimately reduced, and accordingly, upkeep of maintenance is essentially monitored. Another concept or the advantage of material resource planning is you need to prepare a plan for all those particular activities. And when we have a certain plan for all those particular activities, tracking or maintenance or record of all the transactions or the material or the inventory is easily possible. So simply we can ensure that whatever material that has been received and how much material is been disbursed or dispatched, the balance between the availability, balance between the disbursement can be easily identified, and accordingly the next order can be planned about what amount or quantity needs to be ordered. And hence in this particular concern, the concept of EOQ, that is economic order quantity, can be easily maintained. And hence for those particular concerns, MRP, that is material requirement planning, is very helpful or it is essential. It utilizes the capacity and allots the appropriate amount of time to items based on the demand forecast. Another objective of the material resource planning or material requirement planning is that whatever amount of goods and services that have been required on a machine or on the particular cycle, it utilizes a certain amount of time to see that the capacity does not remain idle. So reduction of idle time of a certain machine is automatically minimized, and accordingly the cycle that is being undertaken for the production of the goods and services is always being very effective. Now let's look at the various perspectives of disadvantages of material resource planning. Material resource planning is sometimes advantageous, whereas there are certain limitations or disadvantages associated with the MRP. It is extremely reliant on the data that has been provided. Hence, material requirement planning is completely based on the data that has been provided by the manufacturing or the operations or the production department to the inventory or stores department. So, if there is a mismatch or if there is a certain wrongness in the data that has been created by the manufacturing or the operations or the production department, then accordingly the planning of the inventory or stores department also gets collapsed, and hence it is completely data based, and accordingly if the data is given in a wrong format or in a wrong concern, then accordingly it may impact or hamper the planning that has been undertaken at the inventory department. Another disadvantage of material requirement planning is if the data is inaccurate, the resultant material that is being planned in the inventory or stores department will also be erroneous, and it will be also not in a proper concern. And hence, we have to see that whatever data that has been provided, it should be very specific and accurate, and accordingly, there should be no any mismatch within the data, and accordingly, the data should be very specific. It necessitates the upkeep of a comprehensive database, including the relevant information such as inventory records, production schedules, and so on, without which the output would go wrong. So here in this case, if the data that has been provided with respect to the input, with respect to the output, with respect to the goods and commodities that have been used, and the time that is required for the production cycle, if all the data goes wrong, then accordingly, the maintenance or upkeep of the records at the inventory or stores department also gets collapsed, and hence the final output will also be wrong in a particular concern, and hence the proper or reliable data is essentially required. At the end of this particular stage, we need to understand whosoever are the end users of this particular information. Either the stores manager or either the production manager, they have to cross-check and verify the data at every stage whenever it is being exchanged with the departments. So, most out of the material planning system, the manager who is looking after the verification of data should be very cautious and alert while listening or while providing the data to the departments in inter-exchange. And lastly, the material resource planning system necessitates a significant time and financial investment. So, a proper investment of time as well as the money is been essentially required to see that the material requirement planning is run very effectively in the organization. If these particular activities are not being conducted effectively, then the entire production cycle may go in waste, and your efforts may go in vain. Now, let's understand how material resource planning is interdependency on the business. It will help to figure out the new amount or money that is required in terms of cash expenditure for your day-to-day capital requirement. The day-to-day capital requirement of the organization is called as working capital. So, for finalization of the shipping of goods and services from one department to another department, one stores to another stores, one company to another company, the amount of money that is been required is the working capital. So, ascertainment of working capital is completely dependent on what amount or quality or quantity of material is been required. So, to figure out certain values, it is necessary that we must have an effective material requirement planning into existence. It aids to procurement team in planning the acquisition of the required materials. So, procurement of required materials within a specified time period for a certain consideration is essentially required with respect to material resource planning. The material that we are procuring, the material that we are passing on from one department to another department should be very effective, and the data that has been provided should be also reliable. And hence, for this particular concern, we need to see that whatever data that has been provided is quite reliable, it is quite complete, and accordingly, there is a proper planning of activities at all the stages. The MRP, that is material requirement planning, helps the sales staff in establishing the final product delivery dates. So, based on the availability of raw material, at what duration the material will be provided, the sales staff can easily able to identify that what quantity of goods and services will be manufactured as a part of finished goods, and how the sales force or the sales delivery of the goods and services can be undertaken. And hence, identification of dates of delivery is easily possible with the proper implementation of material resource planning. Now let's understand how do we implement the material resources planning. First thing, that basic essential requirement is appropriateness of advantages and rewards by the senior management. So, involvement of the senior management, that is top level management, is essentially required to see that the material resource planning that is being implemented is very quite effective and foolproof. So, with this particular concern, the planning that is being undertaken at all the stages will be very effective, and accordingly, the output or the final product will also be very effective and qualitative. All the workers of all the departments should be equally contributed, and they must be well trained to incur or to identify that how MRP, that is material resource planning, can be implemented in a very successful way. So, participation from all levels of management, that is and all levels of department with respect to the lower level management, the middle level management, and the top level management, and simultaneously from all the departments. That is, may it be inventory, may it be finance, may it be marketing, may it be sales, may it be production, may it be human resource, and so on. Everyone should equally contribute and be known to the material resource planning that has been undertaken in the organization. For accurate and dependent data or the outcomes to be very specific, we must be seeing that whatever data that is being shared or exchanged between the department, it should be very precise and accurate so that there is no confusion that is being created, and accordingly our MRP is implemented in a very successful way. So, in conclusion, we can find that the common problem that occurs in retail supply chain management is with respect to the material requirement planning. So, if the material requirement planning goes wrong, then accordingly the entire production activity or the assembly line gets infected, and accordingly there will be not effective production that will be undertaken. The tendency to the retail bias for availability of goods and services at a certain point of delivery is essentially required. So, for those particular concern, we need to see that there is effective implementation of MRP, that is material requirement planning or material resource planning, into existence, and the goods and services are being essentially delivered as and when the time occurs. The material requirement planning always focuses on the concept of matching the demand and supply as a factor. So when the demand and supply are needed to be matched effectively for those particular concerns, there should be an effective implementation of material requirement planning, which will be able to identify or help the organization to see that how those resources are being utilized in a very effective way and how they can be implemented in a better organization to meet the required targets. The various factors with respect to the just-in-time or product availability should be also undertaken to see that there is no material that is being wasted, and accordingly the waste of materials is eliminated. So the concept of JIT, MRP, Kaizen, Kanban always needs to be implemented in the organization. The various three types of costs that may be incurred by the organization may be either related to the value added cost, the business value added cost, and the non-value added cost. So in order to avoid all these particular costs that may incur with respect to the failure in the MRP, it is needed to see that the MRP, that is material requirement planning, is effectively implemented. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what do we mean by forecasting and material requirement planning. What are the various activities that are being undertaken with respect to the forecasting of the material requirement planning, and how all those activities can be performed in the organization. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning at this particular stage. Thank you for your listening. Thank you.